Elon Musk, Chapter 15, Rocket Man, SpaceX 2002. Russia. The launch in the back room of a drab Moscow restaurant consisted of small bites of food interspersed with large shots of vodka. Musk had arrived that morning with Adil Raci and Jim Cantrell on their quest to buy a used Russian rocket for their mission to Mars. He was ragged after a late night of partying during a stopover in Paris. Plus, he was not an experienced drinker, so he didn't fare well. I calculated the weight on the food and the weight of the vodka, and they were roughly equal, he recalls. After many toasts to friendships, the Russians gave the Americans gifts of vodka bottles with labels that had each person's image on a rendering of Mars. Musk, who was holding his head up with his hand, passed out and his head slammed into the table. I don't think I impressed the Russians, he says. That evening, slightly recovered, Musk and his companions met with another group in Moscow that perpetrated to be selling decommissioned missiles. That encounter turned out to be equally bizarre. The Russian in charge was missing a front tooth, so whatever he had spoke loudly, which was often spit would fly out in Musk's direction. At one point, when Musk started his talk about the need to make humans multiplanetary, the Russians got visibly upset. This rocket was never meant for capitalists to use for going to Mars on a bullshit mission, he shouted. Who's your chief engineer? Musk allowed that he was. At that point, Contra recalls, the Russians spit at him. Did he just spit on us, Musk asked. Yeah, he did, Contra answered. I think it's a sign of disrespect. Despite the clown show, Musk and Contra decided to return to Russia in early 2002. Resi didn't come, but Justine did. So did a new member of the team, Mike Griffin, an aerospace engineer who later became the administrator of NASA. This time, Musk focused on buying 2 Denver rockets, which were old missiles. The more he negotiated, the higher the price went up. He finally thought he had a deal to pay $18 million for 2 Denupers, but then they said no. It was $18 million for each. I'm like, dude, that's insane, he says. The Russians then suggested maybe it would be $21 million each. They taunted him, Control recalls. They said, "Oh, little boy, you don't have the money." It was fortunate that the meetings went bad. It prodded Musk to think bigger. Rather than merely using a second-hand rocket to put a demonstration greenhouse on Mars, he would conceive a venture that was far more audacious, one of the most audacious of our times. Privately building rockets that would launch satellites and then humans into orbit and eventually send them to Mars and beyond. I was pretty mad. When I get mad, I try to reframe the problem. First principles. As he stewed about the absurd price the Russians wanted to charge, he employed some first principle thinking, drilling down to the basic physics of the situation and building up from there. This led him to develop what he called an idiot index, which calculated how much more costly a finished product would cost than the cost of its basic materials. If a product had a high idiot index, its cost could be reduced significantly by devastating more efficient manufacturing techniques. Rockets had an extremely high idiot index. Musk began calculating the cost of carbon fiber, metal fuel, and other materials that went into them. The finished product using the current manufacturing methods cost at least 50 times more than that. If humanity was going to Mars, the technology of rockets must radically improve and rely on used rockets, especially old ones from Russia, was not going to push the technology forward. So, on the flight home, he pulled out his computer and started making spreadsheets that detailed all the materials and cost of building a mid-sized rocket. Contrell and Griffin, sitting in the row behind him, ordered drinks and laughed. "What the fuck do you think that idiot savant is doing up there?" Griffin asked Contrell. Musk turned around and gave them an answer. "Hey guys," he said, showing them the spreadsheet, "I think we can build this rocket ourselves." When Contrell looked at the numbers, he said to himself, I'll be damned. That's why he's been borrowing all my books. Then he asked the flight attendant for another drink. SpaceX. When Musk decided he wanted to start his own rocket company, his friends did what true friends do in that situation. They staged an intervention. Whoa, dude, I got screwed by the Russians. Does not equal create a launch company. Alderisi told him. Rissi made a highlight reel of dozens of rockets blowing up, and he corralled friends to fly to Los Angeles, where they gathered with Musk to talk him out of it. They made me watch a reel of rockets exploding because they wanted to convince me that I would lose all my money, Musk says. The arguments about the risks served to strengthen Musk's resolve. He liked risk. If you're trying to convince me that this is a high probability of failure, I'm already there, he told Rescue. The likeliest outcome is that I will lose all my money. But what's the alternative? That there be no progress in space exploration? We've got to give this a shot or we're stuck on Earth forever. It was a rather grandiose mandate from heaven assessment of how indispensable he was to progress of humankind. But like many of Musk's most laughable assertions, it contained a kernel of truth. I wanted to hold out hope that humans could be a spacefaring civilization and be out there among the stars, he says. And there was no chance of that unless a new company was starting to create revolutionary rockets. Musk's space adventure had begun as a non-profit endeavor to inspire interest in mission to Mars, but now he had the combination of motivations that would mark his career. He would do something audacious that was driven by a grand idea, but he also wanted it to be practical and profitable, so that it could sustain itself. That meant using the rockets to launch commercial and governmental satellites. He wanted to start with a smaller rocket that would not be too costly. We're going to be doing dumb things, but let's just not do dumb things on a large scale, he told Contrell. Instead of launching large payloads, as Lockheed and Boeing did, Musk would create a less expensive rocket for the smallest satellites that would make possible for advances in microprocessors. He focused on one key metric: what it cost to get each pound of payload into orbit. The goal of maximizing boost for the buck would guide his obsession with increasing the thrust of the engines, reducing the mass of the rockets, and making them reusable. Musk tried to recruit the two engineers who accompanied him to Moscow, but Mike Griffin did not want to move to Los Angeles. He was working for InQtel, a CIA-funded venture firm based in the Washington, D.C. area, and he was looking at the promising future in science policy. Indeed, President George W. Bush appointed him to the NASA administrator in 2005. Jim Cantrell considered joining, but he asked for a lot of job guarantees that Musk was unwilling to meet. So Musk ended up being by default the company's chief engineer. Musk incorporated space exploration technologies in May 2002. At first, he called the company by its initial SET. A few months later, he highlighted his favorite letter by moving to a more memorable moniker, SpaceX. Its goal, he said in an early presentation, was to launch its first rocket by September 2003 and to send an unmanned mission to Mars by 2010. Thus continued the tradition he had established at PayPal, setting unrealistic timelines that transferred his wild notions from being completely insane to being merely very late. Chapter 16, Fathers and Sons, Los Angeles, 2002. Baby Nevada. Just as Elon was launching SpaceX in May 2002, Justine gave birth to their first child, a boy named Nevada. Because he had been conceived at the annual Burning Men festival held in that state when he was 10 weeks old, the whole family went to Laguna Beach, just south of Los Angeles, for our cousin's wedding. During the reception, a manager at the hotel came in looking for Musk. Something had happened to their baby, he said. When they got back to the room, paramedics were intubating Nevada and giving him oxygen. The nanny explained that he had been sleeping in his crib on his back and at some point had stopped breathing. The cause was probably sudden infant death syndrome, an unexplained malady that is leading cause of infant mortality in developed countries. By the time the paramedics resuscitated him, he had been deprived of oxygen for so long that he was brain dead. Justine later said. Kimball rode to the hospital with Elon, Justine, and the baby. Even though he had been declared brain dead, Nevada was kept on life support for 3 days. When they finally made the decision to turn him off the breathing machine, Elon felt his last heartbeat, and Justine held him in his arms and felt his death rattle. Musk sobbed uncontrollably. He cried like a wolf, his mother said. Cried like a wolf. Because Elon said he could not bear returning home, Kimball arranged for them to stay at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The manager gave them the presidential suite. Elon asked him to get rid of Nevada's clothes and toys, which had been brought to the hotel. It was 3 weeks before Musk would bear to go home and see what had once been his son's room. Musk processed his grief silently. Navid Fork, his friend from Queen's University, flew to Los Angeles to stay with him right after he returned home. Justine and I tried to draw him into conversations about what happened, but he did not want to talk about it, Fork says. Instead, they watched movies and played video games. At one point, after a long silence, Fork asked, "How are you feeling? How are you dealing with it?" Musk completely shut down the conversation. "I've known him long enough to read his face," Fork says. I could tell he was determined not to talk about it. Justine, on the contrary, was very open about emotions. "He wasn't very comfortable with me expressing my feelings over Nevada's death," she says. "He told me I was very emotionally manipulative, wearing my heart on my sleeve." She attributes his emotional repression to the defensive mechanisms he developed during childhood. He shuts down emotions when in dark places, she says. "I think it's a survival thing with him." Errol arrives. When Nevada was born, Elon invited his father to fly from South Africa to see his grandfather. It offered Elon a chance, 13 years after he left South Africa, to reconcile with Errol, or at least to exorcise some demons. Elon was Dad's first son, and maybe he had something to prove him, Kimball says. Errol brought his new wife, their 2 young children, and his wife's 3 children from her previous marriage. Elon paid for all 7 tickets. When they arrived in Raleigh, North Carolina after the first leg of their flight from Johannesburg, Errol was paged by a Delta Airlines representative. "We have some bad news," he was told. "Your son wants us to tell you that Nevada, your grandson, has died." Elon wanted to make sure the airline representative broke the news because he could not bear to speak the words himself. When Errol got on the phone, Kimball explained the situation and said, "Dad, you shouldn't come." He tried to convince him to turn around and fly back to South Africa. Errol refused. "No, we're already in the U.S., so we're coming to Los Angeles." Errol remembers being astounded by the size of the penthouse at the Beverly Wilshire, probably the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. Elon seemed to be in a trance, but he was also very needy in a complex way. He was uncomfortable having his blistery father see him in such a vulnerable state, but he also did not want him to leave. He ended up urging his father and his new family to stay in Los Angeles. "I don't want you to go back," he said. "I will buy you a house here." Kimball was appalled. No, this is a bad idea," he told Elon. "You're forgetting that he's a dark human. Do not do this. Do not do this to yourself." But the harder he tried to talk his brother out of it, the sadder Elon got. Years later, Kimball wrestled with what yearnings was motivating his brother. Watching his own son die, I think that was what drove him to want his father near him, he told me. Elon bought a house in Malibu for Errol and his bride, along with the biggest Land Rover he could find, and he arranged for the children to be put into good schools and chauffeured there each day. But things quickly got weird. Elon was getting concerned that Errol, who was 56, was becoming uncomfortable attentive to one of his stepdaughters, Jana, who was then 15. Elon became furious at his father because of what he perceived as inappropriate behavior, and he had developed a deep sympathy and tugging sense of kinship for Errol's stepchildren. He knew that they had to live with, so he offered to buy Errol a yacht to be harbored 45 minutes from Malibu. He agreed to live there on his own. He could see his family on weekends. That was not only a weird idea, but also a bad one. It made the whole situation stranger. Errol's wife, who was 19 years younger than he, began deferring to Elon. She saw Elon now as a provider in her life and not me, Errol says, and so it became a problematic situation. One day when Earl was on the boat, he got a message from Elon. This situation is not working, he said, and he asked Earl to go back to South Africa. Earl did. A few months later, his wife and family moved back as well. I tried threats, rewards, and arguments to change my father for the better, Elon said. And Musk breaks off for long period of silence. No way, it just got worse. Personal networks are more complex than digital ones. Chapter 17. Reviving Up, SpaceX 2002. Tom Mueller. As a kid growing up in rural Idaho, Tom Mueller loved playing with model rockets. I made dozens. Of course, they didn't last long because I'd always crash them or blow them up. His hometown of St. Maurice was population 2,500, was a logging village about 100 miles south of the Canadian border. His father worked as a lumberjack. As a kid, I was always helping Dad work on his log truck, using the welders and other tools. Mueller says, being hands-on gave me a feel for what worked and what wouldn't. Lanky and sinewy, with a dimpled chin and jet black hair, Mueller had a rough-hewn look of future lumberjack, but inside he was studious like Musk. He immersed himself in the local library, devouring science fiction. For a middle school project, he put crickets inside a model rocket and blasted it off from his backyard to see what effect acceleration would have on them. He learned another lesson instead. The parachutes failed, the rocket smashed to Earth, and the crickets died. At first, he bought rocket kits through the mail, but then he began making his own from scratch. When he was 14, he converted his father's wielding torch into an engine. I injected water into it to see what effect doing that had on its performance, he says. That's kind of a crazy thing, adding water gives you more thirst. The project won him second prize at a regional science fair, which qualified him to go to the international finals in Los Angeles. It was the first time he had been on an airplane. I didn't come close to winning, he says. There were robots and stuff that other kids' fathers had built. At least I had done my project myself. He worked his way through the University of Idaho, spending summers and weekends as a lodger. When he graduated, he moved to Los Angeles to seek work in aerospace. His grades had not been great, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and that helped get him a job at the TRW, which built the rocket engine that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. On weekends, he would go to the moon Yav Desert to the big homemade rockets with fellow members of the Reaction Research Society, a club of rocket enthusiasts funded in 1943. There he partnered with a fellow member, John Garvey, to build what became the world's most powerful amateur rocket engine, weighing 80 pounds. One Sunday in January 2002, while they were working in a rented warehouse on their amateur engine, Garvey mentioned to Mueller that an internet billionaire named Elon Musk wanted to meet him. When Musk arrived, accompanied by Justine, Mueller was shouldering the suspended 80-pound engine as he tried to bolt it to a frame. Musk began peppering him with questions. How much thrust did it have? 13,000 pounds, Mueller answered. Have you ever made anything bigger? Mueller explained that at TRW he had been working on TR-106, which had 650,000 pounds of thrust. What were its popular fuels, Musk asked. Mueller finally quit bolting his engine so he could concentrate on Musk's rapid shot questions. Musk asked Mueller whether he could build an engine as big as TRW's TR-106 on his own. Mueller allowed that he had designed the injection igniter himself, knew the pump system well, and with a team could figure out the rest. How much, Musk asked, would it cost? Mueller replied that the TR was doing it for $12 million. Musk repeated his question, how much would it cost? Oh my lord, that's a tough one, answered Mueller, who was surprised by how fast the conversation had gotten into specifics. At that point, Justine, who was wearing a full-length leather coat, nudged Musk and said it was time to go. He asked Mueller if they could meet the following Sunday. Mueller was reluctant. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and I had just gotten a widescreen TV and wanted to watch the game with some friends. But he sensed it was futile to resist, so he agreed to have Musk over. We watched like maybe one play because we were so engaged in talking about building a launch vehicle, Mueller says. Along with a few other engineers there, they sketched plans for what became the first SpaceX rocket. The first stage they decided would be propelled by engines using liquid oxygen and kerosene. I know how to make that work easily, Mueller said. Musk suggested hydrogen peroxide for the upper stage, which Mueller thought would be difficult to handle. He countered by suggesting nitrogen peroxide, which Musk considered too expensive. They end up agreeing to do liquid oxygen and kerosene on the second stage as well. The football game was forgotten. The rocket was more interesting. Musk offered Mueller the job of head of propulsion. In charge of designing the rocket's engines, Mueller, who had been complaining about the risk-adverse culture at TRW, consulted with his wife. "You'll pick yourself up if you don't do this," she told him. Mueller thus became SpaceX's first hire. One thing that Mueller insisted on was that Musk put 2 years' worth of compensation into escrow. He was not an internet millionaire, and he did not want to take the chance of being unpaid if the venture failed. Musk agreed. It did, however, cause him to consider Mueller an employee rather than a co-founder of SpaceX. It was a fight he had regarding PayPal and would have again involving Tesla. If you're unwilling to invest in a company, he felt you shouldn't qualify as a founder. You cannot ask for 2 years' of salary in escrow and consider yourself a co-founder, he says. There's got to be some combination of inspiration, perspiration, and risk to be a co-founder. Ignition. Once Musk was able to enlist Mueller and a few other engineers, he needed a headquarters and factory. We had been meeting in a hotel conference room, Musk says, so I started driving through the neighborhoods where most of the aerospace companies are, and I found an old warehouse right near the LA airport. The SpaceX headquarters and the adjoining Tesla design studio are technically in Hawthorne, a town within Los Angeles County, next to the airport, but I will refer to the location as LA. In laying out the factory, Musk followed his philosophy that design, engineering, and manufacturing teams would all be clustered together. The people on the assembly line should be able to immediately color a design or engineer and say, "Why the fuck did you make it this way?" He explained to Mueller. If your hand is on a stove and it gets hot, you pull it right off. But if it's someone else's hand on the stove, it will take you longer to do something. As his team grew, Musk infused it with his tolerance for risk and reality-bending willfulness. If you were negative or thought something couldn't be done, you were not invited to the next meeting, Mueller recalls. He just wanted people who would make things happen. It was a good way to dive people to do what they thought was impossible. But it was also a good way to become surrounded by people afraid to give you bad news or questions a decision. Musk and the other young engineers would work late into the night and then fire up a multiplayer shooter game, such as Quake 3 Arena, on their desk computers, conference together their cell planes, and plunge into death matches that could last until 3 a.m. Musk's handle was Random 9, and he was, of course, the most aggressive. "We'd be screaming and yelling at each other like a bunch of lunatics," said one employee. And Elon was right there in the thick of it with us. He was usually triumphant. "He's alarmingly good at those games," said another. "He was insanely fast reactions and knew all the tricks on how to sneak up on people." Musk named the rocket they were building Falcon 1 after the spacecraft from Star Wars. He left it to Mueller to name its engines. He wanted cool names, not just letters and numbers. An employee at one of the contractors was a falconer, and she listed the different species of that bird. Mueller picked Merlin for the engines on the first stage and Kestrel for those on the second stage. Musk rules for rocket building. SpaceX 2002 to 2003. Question every cost. Musk was laser focused on keeping costs down. It was not simply because his own money was on the line, though that was a factor. It also because cost effectiveness was critical for his ultimate goal, which was to colonize Mars. He challenged the prices that aerospace suppliers charged for components, which were usually 10 times higher than similar parts in the auto industry. His focus on cost, as well as his natural controlling instincts, led him to want to manufacture as many components as possible in-house, rather than buy them from suppliers, which was then the standard practice in the rocket and car industries. At one point, SpaceX needed a valve. Mueller recalls, and the supplier said it would cost $250,000. Musk declared that insane and told Mueller they should make it themselves. They were able to do so in months at a fraction of the cost. Another supplier quoted a price of $120,000 for an actuator, and that would swivel the nozzle of the upper stage engines. Musk declared it was not more complicated than a garage door opener, and he told one of his engineers to make it for $5,000. Jeremy Holman, one of the young engineers working for Mueller, discovered that a valve that was used to mix liquids in a car wash system could be modified to work with a rocket fuel. After a supplier delivered some aluminum domes that go on top of the fuel tanks, it jacked up the price for the next batch. It was like a painter who paints half your house for one price, then wants 3 times for the rest, says Mark Junusco, who became Musk's closest colleague at SpaceX. That didn't make Elon too enthusiastic. Musk referred to it as going Russian on him, as the rocket huskers in Moscow had done. Let's go do this ourselves, he told Junosko. So a new part of the assembly facility was added to build domes. After a few years, SpaceX was making in-house 70% of the components of its rockets. When SpaceX began producing its first Merlin engines, Musk asked Mueller how much they weighed. About 1,000 pounds, Mueller responded. The Tesla Model S engine, Musk said, weighed about 4,000 pounds and cost about $30,000 to make. So if the Tesla engine is 4 times as heavy as your engine, why does yours cost so fucking much? One reason was the rocket components were subject to hundreds of specifications and requirements mandated by the military and NASA. At big aerospace companies, engineers followed those religiously. Musk did the opposite. He made his engineers question all specifications. They would later become step 1 in a 5-point checklist dubbed the algorithm. That became his oft-repeated mantra when developing products. Whenever one of his engineers cited a requirement as a reason for doing something, Musk would grill them. Who made that requirement? And answering, the military or the legal department, was not good enough. Musk would insist that they know the name of the actual person who made the requirement. We would talk about how we were going to qualify an engine or certify a fuel tank, and he would ask, why do we want to do that? Says Tim Bouza, a refugee from Boeing, who would become SpaceX vice president of launch and testing. And we would say, there's a million military specification says it's a requirement. And he'd reply, who wrote that? Why does it make sense? All requirements should be treated as recommendations. He instructed the only immutable ones were those decreed by the laws of physics. Have a maniacal sense of urgency. When Mueller was working on the Merlin engines, he presented an aggressive schedule for completing one of the versions. It wasn't aggressive enough for Musk. How the fuck can it take so long, he asked. This is stupid. Cut it in half. Mueller balked. You can't just take a schedule like that we already cut in half and then cut it in half again, he said. Musk looked at him coldly and told him to stay behind after the meeting. When they were alone, he asked Mueller whether he wanted to remain in charge of engines. When Mueller said he did, Musk replied, then when I ask for something, you fucking give it to me. Mueller agreed and arbitrarily cut the schedule in half. And guess what, he says? We ended up developing it in about the time that we had put in that original schedule. Sometimes Musk's insane schedule produced the impossible. Sometimes they didn't. I learned never to tell him no, Mueller says. Just say you're going to try, then later explain why it doesn't work out. Musk insisted on setting unrealistic deadlines, even if they weren't necessarily. Such as when he ordered test stands to be erected in weeks for rocket engines that had not yet been built. A maniacal sense of urgency is our operating principle, he repeatedly declared. The sense of urgency was good for its own sake. It made his engineers engage in first principles thinking. But as Mueller points out, it was also corrosive. If you set an aggressive schedule that people think might be able to make, they will try to put out extra effort, he says. But if you give them a schedule, they're physically impossible. Engineers aren't stupid. They're demoralize them. If it's Elon's biggest weakness. Steve Jobs did something similar. His colleagues called it his reality distortion field. He set unrealistic deadlines, and when people balked, he would stare at them without blinking and say, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." Although the practice demoralized people, they end up accomplishing things that other companies couldn't. Even though we failed to meet most schedules or cost targets that Elon laid out, we still beat all of our peers, Mueller admits. We developed the low-cost, most awesome rockets in history, and we end up feeling pretty good about it, even if Dad wasn't always happy with us. Learn by failing. Musk took an iterative approach to design. Rockets and engines would be quickly prototyped. It's tested, blown up, revised, and tried again until finally something worked. Move fast, blow things up, repeat. It's not how well you avoid problems, Mueller says. It's how fast you figure out what the problem is and fix it. For example, there was a set of military specifications on how many hours each new version of an engine needed to be tested for, under a long list of different conditions. It was a tedious approach and very expensive, Tim Booza explains. Elon told us just to build one engine and fire it up on the test stand. If it worked out, put it on the rocket and fly it. Because SpaceX was a private company, and because Musk was willing to flout rules, it would take the risks it wanted. Booza and Mueller pushed their engines until they broke and then said, okay, now we know what the limits are. This belief in iterative design meant that SpaceX needed a freewheeling place for testing. At first, they considered the Moyov Air and Spaceport, but a county board kept delaying a decision on SpaceX application in late 2002. We need to get the hell out of Moyov, Mueller told Musk. California is difficult. Musk gave a talk that December at Purdue, which was renowned rocket testing program, and he brought with him Mueller and Booza. There they met an engineer who worked for Beale Aerospace, one of the many private rocket companies that had gone bankrupt. He described Beale's abandoned test site outside of McGregor, Texas, about 26 miles east of Waco, and gave them a cell number of a former employee who still lived in the area. Musk decided they should fly there that day. On the way, they called the former employee Joe Allen and reached him at Texas State Technical College, where he was studying computer coding after losing his job at Beale. Allen had never heard of Musk or SpaceX, but he agreed to meet them under tripod of the old testing suit. When they landed on Musk's jet, they had no trouble finding the tripod in the desert. It was 110 feet tall. At its base was Allen standing next to the beat-up old Chevy pickup. "Holy crap," Mueller muttered to Booza as they walked the site. "Everything we need is here." There were test stands, water systems, and a blockhouse in the scrubby grass. Booza started to enthusiasm about how well the facility would work. Musk pulled him aside. "Stop saying how good all this is," he said. "You're making it more expensive." Musk ended up hiring Allen on the spot and was able to lease the McGregor site and its abandoned equipment for a mere $45,000 a year. Damn. Thus beginning a buddy movie in which a platoon of die-hard rocket engineers led by Mueller and Booza, which occasionally visits by Musk, ignited engines and set off explosions, which they dubbed rapid, unscheduled dissemblance, in a hard scrabble patch of concrete and rattlesnakes in the Texas desert. The first test firing of a Maryland came on the night of Mueller's birthday, March 11, 2003. The kerosene and liquid oxygen was injected into the thrust chamber and burned for just half a second, which was all they needed to ensure that the mechanisms worked. They celebrated with a $1,000 bottle of Remy Martin cognac, which had been a gift to Musk for speaking at a space conference. His assistant, Mary Beth Brown, had given it to Mueller to use when a suitable cause for celebration arose. They polished it off from paper cups. Improvise. Mueller and his team would spend 12-hour days testing engines at McGuire, grab dinner at Outback Steakhouse, then have a late night conference call with Musk, who prepped them with technical questions. Once he would erupt with a controlled yet searing fury of an engine burn when an engineer did not know an answer. With his tolerance for risk, Musk pushed them to find makeshift solutions. Using machine tools that Mueller had brought to Texas, they would try to make fixes on the spot. One night, lightning struck a test stand, knocking out the pressurization system for a fuel tank. That led to a bulge and a rip in one of the tank's membranes. In a normal aerospace company, they would have meant replacing the tanks, which would take months. Nah, just fix it, Musk said. Go up there with some hammers and just pound it and back out. Wield it and keep going. Booza thought that was nuts, but he had learned to follow the boss's order. So they went out to the test stand and pounded out the bulge. Musk jumped on his plane to make the 3-hour flight to oversee things personally. When he showed up, we began testing the tank with gas in it. And it held, Booza says. Elon believes that every situation is salvageable. That taught us a lot, and it was actually fun. It also saved SpaceX months of getting its initial rocket tested. Of course, that didn't always work. Musk tried a similar, unconventional approach in late 2003, when cracks developed in the heat diffusing material inside the thrust chambers of the engines. First one, then two, then three of the first chambers cracked. Mueller recalls it was a disaster. When Musk got the bad news, he ordered Mueller to find a way to fix them. We can't throw them away, he said. There's no way to fix them, Mueller replied. It was the type of statement that infuriated Musk. He told Mueller to put the 3 chambers on his jet and fly with him to the SpaceX factory in Los Angeles. His idea was to apply a layer of epoxy glue that would seep into the cracks and cure the problem. When Mueller told him the idea was crazy, they got into a shouting match. Finally, Mueller relented. He's the boss, he told the team. When the chambers arrived at the factory, Musk was dressed in the fine leather boots for a Christmas party he was planning to attend. He never got to the party. He spent all night helping to apply the epoxy and ruining his boots. The gamble failed. As soon as pressure was applied, the epoxy came unstuck. The chambers had to be redesigned, and the schedule for the launch slipped 4 months. But Musk's willingness to work all night at the factory pursuing the innovative idea inspired his engineers not to be afraid of trying offbeat fixes. A pattern was set. Try new ideas and be willing to blow things up. The residents in the area got used to explosions. The cows, however, did not. Like pioneers circling the wagons, they would run in a circle, protecting the young calves in the center when a bang happened. The engineers at McGuire set up what they called a cow cam so they could watch.